High and welcome, the crystal chandelier cast 1,000 fractured stars across the ballroom. But for Clara Ashford, the light felt cold, metallic. Her ex-husband, Nicholas "Nick" Mercer, stood on stage, his smile as polished as the marble floors. He was accepting an award for philanthropy, a word that sounded like a foreign curse on his tongue. Then he looked directly at her, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I owe so much to my ex-wife, Clara," he began. The crowd cooing. "She taught me the most valuable lesson of all, how to recognize a liability." The silence was a living thing, suffocating and sharp, before it was shattered by a wave of shocked gasps and nervous laughter. In that moment, Clara didn't just feel humiliated. She felt erased. But Nick had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he had erased a liability. He had no idea he had just unleashed one. The annual St. Regis Philanthropy Gala was the glittering apex of New York's social calendar, a place where old money and new tech collided in a symphony of champagne flutes and hushed seven-figure donations. For Clara Ashford, it had always felt less like a celebration of charity and more like a performance of it. She stood near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, the chill of it seeping into her bones, despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. Her dress, a deep sapphire silk that cost more than most people's cars, felt like a costume. She watched Nick on the stage, his hand resting proprietorially on the sleek, undeserved award. He was a master of the public gaze, a man sculpted from charm and ambition. To the world, he was Nicholas Mercer, the self-made real estate mogul who could turn forgotten warehouses into shimmering towers of glass and steel. To Clara, he was the architect of her gilded cage. Their marriage had been a merger, not a romance. Her father, a titan of old-world finance, had seen Nick's raw, hungry ambition as the perfect engine to carry the family's legacy into the new century. Clara, then a quiet, artistically inclined young woman with a portfolio of stunning architectural sketches and a heart full of softer dreams, was the price of the deal. She was meant to be his anchor, his connection to a world of established power he desperately craved. Instead, she had become his shadow. "He's certainly enjoying his moment," a smooth voice said beside her. It was Adrienne Blackwell, her lawyer, and one of the few people who knew the full, unvarnished truth of her marriage. Clara offered a tight, practiced smile. "He always does." Nick's speech began with the requisite platitudes, thanking the board, praising the cause. He was magnetic. His voice a carefully modulated baritone that commanded attention. Clara felt a familiar bitter ache. She had helped him rehearse these speeches in the early days, softening his rough edges, teaching him which fork to use, which names to remember. She had been his behind-the-scenes strategist. Her keen insights into market trends and human psychology, the invisible scaffolding that supported his meteoric rise. He absorbed her ideas so completely that he genuinely believed they were his own. Then his eyes found hers across the cavernous room. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips. It was a smile she knew well, the one that preceded a killing blow, whether in a boardroom or their soundproofed bedroom. "But I have to be honest," Nick continued, his tone shifting to one of mock confession. "The real credit for my success, it doesn't just belong to my team." He paused, letting the anticipation build. The room was rapt. "I owe so much to my ex-wife, Clara." A polite, sympathetic murmur rippled through the audience. Divorces in their circle were common, but public acknowledgments were a delicate art. Clara's stomach tightened. This was not an olive branch. It was a sharpening of the knife. "She's here tonight, looking as lovely as ever," he said, gesturing vaguely in her direction. 100 pairs of eyes swiveled to find her. She felt like a specimen pinned to a board. "Clara taught me the most valuable lesson a businessman can ever learn." He let the silence hang, a maestro of tension. Clara could feel Adrienne tense beside her, a protective instinct radiating from him. She taught me how to recognize a liability. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The air crackled. A few people gasped. Someone near the front tittered nervously, unsure if it was a joke. But Clara saw the cold, triumphant glint in Nick's eyes. It was no joke. It was a public execution. He was branding her in front of everyone who mattered in their world as dead weight. The woman he had to cut loose to achieve his greatness. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it was almost brilliant. He was retroactively erasing her contribution, painting their entire history with a single brutal stroke. He wasn't just divorcing her. He was liquidating her worth, her very identity. The initial shock gave way to a wave of nervous, sycophantic laughter from those in Nick's orbit. A sound that grated on Clara's raw nerves. The rest of the room was a sea of stunned, pitying faces, and pity, she realized, with a surge of icy clarity, was worse than hatred. Pity meant they believed him. She held his gaze. Her expression, a mask of serene indifference she had perfected over a decade of silent dinners and public humiliations. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Not here. She tilted her head, a silent, regal acknowledgement, as if she were accepting a compliment. But inside, the gilded cage she had lived in for so long didn't just rattle. It shattered. And through the broken bars, something she had kept locked away for a very long time. Something fierce and formidable was beginning to stir. Nick thought he was closing a chapter. He had no idea he had just started a war. The walk out of the St. Regis ballroom was the longest of Clara's life. Every step was a battle against the tremor in her knees. The air, once filled with the scent of lily and expensive perfume, now seemed thick with the stench of her own humiliation. The whispers followed her like a trail of smoke curling around the edges of polite conversation. Ah, can you believe the nerve? Always said she was out of her depth. Poor thing. She looks utterly broken. She kept her chin high, her eyes fixed on the grand gold leaf doors. Adrienne was a silent, solid presence at her side, a bulwark against the tide of stares. He didn't offer platitudes or apologies. He simply walked with her, his presence a quiet statement of loyalty that she clung to like a lifeline. Once inside the blessedly anonymous corridor, the facade began to crack. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path through her perfect makeup. She swiped it away with a furious, trembling hand. "The car is waiting, Clara," Adrienne said, his voice low and even. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump of jagged glass in her throat. The world had narrowed to a pinpoint, the cool night air, the waiting Blacktown car, the escape. The ride back to her penthouse on Park Avenue was a blur of city lights smeared across the rain-slicked windows. She didn't live in the monolithic, sterile apartment she had once shared with Nick. After the divorce, she had bought this place, a pre-war classic with high ceilings, intricate moldings, and a soul. It was the first home that had ever felt truly hers. Tonight, it felt like a fortress she was retreating to, wounded and defeated. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, the iron control she had maintained finally snapped. Her breath came in ragged, shuddering gasps. She leaned against the door, pressing her forehead to the cool wood, and let the silence of the apartment envelop her. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an echo chamber replaying Nick's words, the shocked faces, the pitting stares, a liability. The word was a poison seeping into the foundations of her identity. For 10 years, she had been the silent partner, the ghost in the machine of his success. Her insights had secured the financing for his first skyscraper. Her design aesthetic had transformed his soulless developments into coveted properties. Her emotional intelligence had smoothed over his brutish negotiation tactics time and time again. She had done it all quietly, believing it was her duty as a wife, believing that her contribution, though invisible to the world, was the bedrock of their partnership. She had traded her own ambitions for his, convincing herself it was a noble sacrifice. Now he had taken that sacrifice and twisted it into a weapon against her. He hadn't just denied her contribution. He had claimed it was a burden he had to overcome. She walked through the darkened apartment, her silk dress whispering against the polished floors. In the living room, a vast canvas leaned against one wall. A swirling abstract of blues and grays she had painted the week the divorce was finalized. It was chaotic, turbulent, but alive. It was everything she felt, but could never say. Her phone, left on the marble console table in the foyer, began to buzz incessantly. A quick glance showed a cascade of notifications, texts from concerned friends, missed calls from her publicist, and a dozen news alerts. The story was already breaking. Nicholas Mercer's shocking gala speech. Billionaire calls ex-wife a liability in public takedown. Socialites stunned by Mercer's brutal honesty. Brutal honesty. They were calling it honesty. The narrative was already being set in stone, and Nick was holding the chisel. She sank onto the velvet sofa, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a profound, hollow ache. The psychological warfare had been a constant in their marriage. The subtle digs, the gaslighting, the way he would dismiss her ideas in private, only to present them as his own in public the next day. But this was different. This was scorched earth. He wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to annihilate her. Why? The divorce had been quiet, surgically precise, just as she'd wanted. She hadn't contested his ownership of the company. She had taken a generous settlement, a fraction of what she was truly owed, but enough to ensure her silence and a clean break. She had wanted peace. But Nick didn't understand peace. He only understood domination. He couldn't stand the thought of her existing outside of his control, of her having a life that wasn't defined by him. By publicly devaluing her, he was attempting to control her narrative forever, ensuring that any future success she might have would always be tainted by the perception that she was the woman who had held him back. A wave of nausea rolled over her. For a moment, she allowed herself to drown in the despair. He had won. He had taken her name, her history, her contribution, and burned it all to ash on a public stage. She was nothing but the ghost of his past. A cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. She closed her eyes. The image of his triumphant smile burned into her mind. The laughter, the pity, the silence, the echo of it all threatened to consume her. She stayed there motionless in the dark for a very long time, letting the full weight of his betrayal settle over her. She had to feel it all, the sharp edges and the crushing weight of it. She had to know exactly what he had done, because only when she understood the depth of the wound could she begin to calculate the cost of the revenge. And as the city slept, a cold, hard certainty began to crystallize in the ruins of her heart. The bill was coming due. The sun rose over Manhattan, casting long shadows that cut across Clara's living room floor like prison bars. She hadn't slept. The sapphire dress lay pulled on the floor where she had stepped out of it, a shed skin. Dressed in a simple black cashmere sweater and trousers, she sat at her glass desk, a steaming mug of black coffee untouched beside her. The grief and shock of the previous night had receded, burned away by the cold, clean fire of fury. Nick thought he knew her. He knew the quiet, accommodating wife. He knew the woman who would shrink from a public confrontation, who would absorb his cruelty and retreat into silence. He had no idea who he had divorced. The divorce settlement he had found so generous was a masterpiece of misdirection crafted by Adrienne with her specific secret instructions. Nick, in his arrogance, had focused on the tangible assets, the real estate, the stock portfolio, the art collection. He had willingly, almost eagerly, signed away the things he couldn't quantify. He had given her back her maiden name, Ashford. And with it, he had unwittingly given her back the keys to an empire he didn't even know existed. Her father, Reginald Ashford, had not been a simple financier. He was a weaver of networks, a collector of loyalties. When he passed, he left Clara more than just money. He left her his legacy of influence, a complex web of holding companies, private equity stakes, and decades-old alliances that spanned the globe. It was a silent, unseen empire managed by a small, fiercely loyal team who reported only to her. For 10 years, she had let that empire lie dormant, honoring the role she had chosen as Nick's wife. She had access to its vast resources, but she never wielded its power. It was her secret, her safety net. Now it was her arsenal. She picked up her phone. It was 6 a.m. She didn't hesitate. Her first call was to Adrian Blackwell, who answered on the first ring. "I'm awake," was all he said, his voice grim. "I need a full asset breakdown of Mercer Development's current and pending deals," Clara said, her tone devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used when analyzing a balance sheet, not discussing the man who had shattered her world. "I want to know every partner, every lender, every investor, every subcontractor. I want to know whose palms he's greased and whose boots he's licked. I want the entire blueprint of his professional life." By noon, there was a pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of understanding. "It's already in progress, Clara. I anticipated this good," she said. "My second call is to Mr. Tishi Mori in Tokyo. Please arrange a secure video conference for 18 p.m. New York time." Adrian's breath hitched slightly. Tishi was the reclusive head of one of Japan's most powerful investment firms. A man who had been a close confidant of her father's for 40 years. He was a ghost in the market, but his movements caused tidal waves. Nick had been trying to get a meeting with him for 3 years, desperate for Mori's backing on his new Hudson Yards project. He had no idea Mori's son sent Clara a birthday card every year. "Consider it done," Adrian said. "What's the agenda?" "A lesson in liabilities," Clara replied and hung up. Her fingers moved swiftly across the encrypted tablet that was her direct line to her father's world. She sent a single-coded message to a man named Leonard Leo Zhang in Hong Kong, a logistics and shipping magnate whose fleet controlled key supply chains for construction materials across North America. The message was simple. Review all contracts associated with Mercer Development. Invoke Clause 17B. Await further instruction. Clause 17B was an Ashford-specific contractual term buried deep in the boilerplate of dozens of his suppliers' agreements. It was an ethics and reputation clause, allowing for immediate termination of services if a partner engaged in conduct that could bring disrepute to the venture. Nick's public performance was about to have very real, very expensive consequences. Next, she pulled up a file labeled the Nightingale Fund. It was a venture capital fund she had been quietly managing for years, using her own money and her sharp eye for disruptive technology. It was her one private rebellion during her marriage, a way to keep her mind sharp. One of her most successful investments was in a revolutionary new green concrete formula developed by a small startup in Germany called Vidian. Mercer Development had just won a massive city contract to build a new sustainable municipal complex, a project Nick had touted as his legacy. The bid was contingent on using cutting-edge, environmentally friendly materials. Vidian was the only supplier. Nick's team had been negotiating with them for months, unaware that the final decision to sell to him rested not with some anonymous board in Berlin, but with the woman he had just publicly branded as worthless. She stared at the Vidian file, her finger hovering over the contact information. This was the first real test. This wasn't about old loyalties or contractual loopholes. This was her own creation, her own power. The rage from the night before had cooled into something far more dangerous. Purpose. Nick operated on a simple, brutal philosophy. Power was loud. It was public. It was dominance. He would never understand the true nature of power. True power was silent. It was the invisible hand that could steady a foundation or with a single calculated move, pull the cornerstone, and watch the entire edifice crumble. Nick had built his towers of glass and steel in the sky for all to see. Her empire was subterranean, its roots wrapped around the very foundations of the city. He had humiliated her in his world. She was about to erase him from hers. The first stone to fall from Nick's empire landed not with a crash, but with the quiet click of a terminated video call. It was Monday morning, 4 days after the gala. Nick Mercer sat in his corner office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking Central Park. He was feeling invincible. The gala incident had created a stir exactly as he'd intended. The initial shock had morphed into a narrative he was expertly shaping. He was the bold, nonsense truth-teller, a man unburdened by sentimentality. His investors loved it. It projected strength. His phone buzzed. It was his head of procurement, a man named Henderson, his voice tight with anxiety. "We have a problem with the Vidian deal, Nick." Nick leaned back in his leather chair, annoyed by the interruption. "What problem?" "We met their price. Tell them to send the damn contract." "They're not sending it. They've pulled out." Henderson stammered. "I just got off a call with their CEO. He said, and I quote, 'We have decided to pursue a partnership that aligns more closely with our company's core values of respect and integrity.'" Nick sat bolt upright. "What the hell does that mean?" "It's concrete." "What do values have to do with it?" "Did you offer them more money?" "They said it's not about the money. The decision is final." "They wouldn't elaborate." Nick slammed the phone down, a vein throbbing in his temple. It was inexplicable. A minor, infuriating setback. He'd find another supplier. It would cause delays, cost him a penalty on the city contract, but it was manageable. He chalked it up to some eccentric German CEO with a misplaced moral compass. He had no idea the decision had been made from a penthouse on Park Avenue. Clara had spoken to the young Vidian CEO, Felix Koig, a man whose company she had funded when no one else would. She hadn't issued a command. She had simply told him the story of her marriage, of her silent contributions to the very designs Nick was now famous for. Then she told him what Nick had done at the gala. "Your product is about building stronger, more sustainable foundations, Felix," she had said, her voice calm and even. "Ask yourself if you want your foundation to be part of his legacy." The decision had been his, but she had drawn the map. The next stone was larger. Liu Jiang, the Hong Kong shipping magnate, had followed her instructions perfectly. Citing Clause 17b, his company, Oceanic Transit, which controlled the primary supply chain for high-grade steel to the entire eastern seaboard, had legally frozen all shipments to Mercer development sites, pending a reputational review. Panic began to ripple through Nick's company. Work on 3 different construction sites ground to a halt. The message from Oceanic Transit was polite, corporate, and utterly impenetrable. It spoke of mitigating reputational risk and fiduciary duty to our shareholders. Nick, in a fit of rage, got Liu Jiang on the phone personally. "What is this, Liu? We've been working together for 5 years." Liu Jiang, a man whose grandfather had made a blood oath with Clara's grandfather, was the picture of calm regret. "My apologies, Nicholas. It is a board decision. The optics of your recent public statements have raised concerns. We cannot be seen to endorse such sentiment. It is a matter of brand alignment." "Brand alignment? We're talking about steel beams, not handbags," Nick roared. "In today's world, everything is a brand," Jung replied smoothly and ended the call. Now Nick was bleeding money. Every day of delay cost him millions in penalties and idle labor. His project managers were frantic. His investors were starting to make nervous phone calls. The narrative of the bold truth-teller was starting to sound a lot like reckless liability. But the master stroke, the move that would transform Nick's problems from a crisis into a catastrophe, was yet to come. It would happen at 8 kilometers New York time, in the quiet, secure video conference with Mr. Tishi. My Clarira sat at her desk, the city lights twinkling behind her. On the screen, the face of Morrison appeared. He was an elderly man with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 boardrooms and the weight of a culture that prized honor above all else. They spoke in Japanese, a language Clara was fluent in, a skill Nick had always dismissed as a quaint hobby. She didn't speak of revenge. She didn't need to. She spoke of her father. She spoke of legacy, of the trust her family had placed in partners over the generations. She spoke of the architectural design for the Hudson Yards project, pointing out the subtle, brilliant flourishes that Nick had stolen directly from her old sketchbooks. Then she told him what Nick had said on that stage. Morrison listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. He looked not at her, but through the screen as if seeing a ghost. "Ashford's son," he said finally, his voice raspy with age. "Your father once told me that a man's true character is not measured by the towers he builds, but by the foundations he honors. A man who dishonors the foundation of his own house cannot be trusted to build for others." He bowed his head slightly. "My firm's interest in the Hudson Yards project was predicated on the understanding that it was a partnership of integrity. That understanding is now broken. We will not be investing." He didn't need to say more. Maury's withdrawal wouldn't just pull his own firm's billion-dollar investment. He was the lead dog. Where he went, a dozen other major international funds followed. His rejection was a vote of no confidence that would echo from Tokyo to London to Wall Street. Clara bowed her head in return, a single tear of gratitude, not sorrow, tracing a path down her cheek. Ariato Morrison. When the screen went dark, she looked out at the city. Nick's towers were out there, glittering monuments to his ego, but they were built on foundations of sand, held together by deals and alliances that were now one by one turning to dust. He had thrown the first stone, a public theatrical display. Her response was silent, invisible, and absolute. She wasn't just throwing stones back. She was causing an earthquake. Nick Mercer lived his life in a state of perpetual forward motion. He didn't believe in introspection or self-doubt. They were luxuries for lesser men. So when the first tremors hit his empire, his instinct was not to look for a cause, but to simply push harder, to outrun the problem. The Vidian deal collapsing was an annoyance. The oceanic transit freeze was a serious logistical nightmare. But the call from his CFO on Tuesday afternoon was the first time a sliver of genuine fear pierced his armor of arrogance. "Maury is out," his CFO, a perpetually stressed man named Samuel Trent, said, his voice hollow. "He's pulled his letter of intent for the Hudson Yards funding. And he's not the only one. The entire Japanese consortium is gone. The sovereign wealth fund from the Emirates just put their commitment under review. The whole financing package is unraveling, Nick." Nick stared out his window, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. Unraveling? It was a done deal. Get them back. Offer them better terms. It's not the terms. Samuel sighed. The sound of a man who has already had this conversation a dozen times. The word is out. Maury's rejection has spooked everyone. The story is that he found an integrity issue with the project's leadership. Integrity issue? Nick scoffed, the sound harsh and loud in the sterile quiet of his office. "I am the most successful developer in this city. My integrity is built in steel and glass." But even as he said it, a cold knot tightened in his gut. The timing was too coincidental. Vidian's talk of values, Zhang's excuse of brand alignment, Maury's concern about integrity. It was all happening in the days immediately following the gala. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. Clara, impossible. She didn't have the spine, let alone the connections. She was an artist, a hostess, a beautiful piece of decor. Her world was charity lunches and museum boards. The idea that she could orchestrate a multi-pronged international corporate assault was ludicrous. It was like suspecting the house cat of orchestrating a wolf hunt. His paranoia, however, began to curdle into a frantic, misdirected rage. He blamed his team. He screamed at Henderson for failing to secure the concrete supplier. He eviscerated his legal department for not having ironclad contracts with the shipping company. He told his CFO to do his damn job and find new money. He spent the next 2 days in a blur of frantic, aggressive action. He called in favors, bullied junior executives at rival firms, and tried to leverage his public profile to project an image of unshakable confidence. He gave a smug interview to the Wall Street Journal, dismissing the rumors as the nervous chatter of competitors who can't keep pace. But behind the scenes, the cracks were spreading. A high-profile architect, a woman at the top of her field, suddenly backed out of a new residential project, citing creative differences. A city councilman who had been his staunchest ally was suddenly unavailable to take his calls. A banking executive he golfed with every month sent a curtail canceling their next game. It felt like the world was quietly turning its back on him. The rejections were always polite, always couched in vague corporate speak, but they were uniform in their finality. It was like hitting a wall of smoked glass. He could see the vague shapes of people on the other side, but he couldn't get through, and he couldn't understand why. By Thursday evening, the pressure was becoming unbearable. He was in his office late, long after the rest of his staff had gone home, nursing a glass of expensive scotch. He was staring at a photo on his desk. It was from the early years of his marriage to Clara. They were on a boat in the Mediterranean. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the sun catching the gold in her hair. He looked proprietary, his arm firmly around her, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He had always seen her as his greatest acquisition. Beautiful, elegant, with a pedigree that opened doors his ambition couldn't kick down. He had underestimated her intelligence, mistaking her quiet nature for a lack of substance. Her insights, which he had so seamlessly absorbed, he had come to see as his own intuition. Her warnings, which he had often ignored, he remembered only as her being overly cautious, a liability to his bold vision. The word echoed in his mind, liability. He had said it to hurt her, yes, but also to define her, to put her in a box so that he would never have to confront the uncomfortable truth of his own dependence on her. He needed her to be weak so that he could feel strong. A sudden chilling thought entered his mind. What if he was wrong? What if her silence hadn't been weakness, but observation? What if her world wasn't just museums and charities? Her father, Reginald Ashford. The man had been a legend, a phantom who moved markets with a whisper. Nick had married Clara to get access to that world. But Reginald had kept him at arm's length, always polite, always watching, and he had adored Clara. Could she possibly be the architect of this silent, systematic dismantling of his life? He threw the glass against the wall. It shattered, the scotch streaking down the polished wood like blood. The sound was sharp, violent, but it did nothing to silence the terrifying question that was now screaming in his mind. He had publicly tried to erase her. What if in response she was quietly, methodically, and successfully erasing him? The thought was so terrifying, so utterly emasculating that he couldn't bear it. He was Nicholas Mercer. He was the builder of empires. He was not a man who could be undone by a ghost. By Friday, exactly 1 week after the gala, Nick Mercer's world was no longer cracking. It was imploding. The silent, invisible earthquake Clara had triggered was now sending shock waves that were devastatingly public. The Wall Street Journal, the same paper he had given a smug interview to just days before, ran a front-page story on their business section. The headline was brutal. Mercer's Empire of Sand, how Hudson Yard's sure thing became Wall Street's biggest gamble. The article, meticulously researched and citing anonymous sources from the highest levels of international finance, detailed the catastrophic collapse of his funding. It mentioned the withdrawal of the Mori Consortium, the freeze by Oceanic Transit, and the failure to secure a supplier for the Sustainable City contract. It didn't name Clara. It didn't have to. It painted a picture of a CEO who had become suddenly inexplicably toxic. The article used the word liability 4 times, each one a dagger twisting in Nick's gut. He sat in his office. The newspaper spread before him like an obituary and felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child. Helplessness, his frantic calls, his threats, his blustering confidence. None of it had worked. It was like punching at smoke. The final killing blow came not from a bank or a supplier, but from the one place he thought he was untouchable, his own company. He had called an emergency board meeting, planning to project strength to lay out a recovery plan he had cobbled together overnight. He walked into the boardroom, a space that had always been his stage, and was met with a wall of cold, unforgiving stares. The men and women around the polished mahogany table were not his employees. They were his partners, his investors, people who had entrusted him with hundreds of millions of dollars. An elderly, formidable woman named Vivian Harcourt, the matriarch of a family that held a 15% stake in Mercer Development, spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Nicholas, we have a problem." "It's a temporary setback, Vivian," Nick began, his voice straining to sound confident. "Market jitters." "I have it under control, do you?" She countered, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Because my sources tell me this isn't market jitters. This is a targeted systematic dismantling of our supply chain and financial backing. Someone is actively working to bankrupt this company. Someone with very long arms and a very deep memory." A younger board member, a tech billionaire who had invested heavily in the Hudson Yards project, chimed in. "We're exposed, Nick, massively. The penalty clauses on the city contract alone could trigger a default on our other loans. The stock has dropped 30% since that article came out this morning. We are in free fall." Nick looked from face to face, searching for an ally and finding none. He saw only accusation, fear, and a dawning ruthless pragmatism. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vivian Harcourt slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was his resignation pre-written. "We are invoking the key person clause in your contract," she said, her tone final. "Your recent public behavior, coupled with this catastrophic loss of confidence from our financial partners, has made you a material risk to the company's survival. You have become a liability." The word, his own word, was delivered with such surgical precision that he actually flinched. They were using his own weapon against him. This was the ultimate humiliation, far worse than anything he had done to Clara. She had been an outsider. This was his own kingdom, his own board, casting him out. Casting. "You can't do this." He snarled, a cornered animal. "I am this company. I built it. You built the facade." Vivian corrected him, her voice like ice. "But you seem to have forgotten that a building is only as strong as its foundation. And the foundation of this company is our investors' trust, which you have single-handedly destroyed. The board has voted. It was unanimous. You will resign effective immediately. In return, we will offer you a severance package that will keep you from suing us. And you will sign an NDA so comprehensive you won't be able to order a coffee in this town without our permission." His vision tunneled. The faces around him blurred. He saw the truth with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about Clara. She had been the catalyst, the unseen force that had started the avalanche. But the board's decision, the swiftness of his execution, this was a result of his own actions, his arrogance, his bullying, his belief that he was untouchable. He had made enemies, and his enemies, smelling blood in the water, had joined the hunt. Clara hadn't just turned his partners against him. She had revealed his true nature to them, and they had acted accordingly. He was erased. In 1 week, his name, once a symbol of power and success, had become synonymous with risk and failure. He had been surgically excised from every deal, every project, every future he had meticulously planned. He had been removed from the company that bore his name. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't look at the paper. He looked out the window at the city, at the skyline he had fought so hard to dominate. It looked distant now, alien. He was no longer a part of it. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had already forgotten him. He had tried to erase his ex-wife, and in doing so, he had given her the power to delete his entire existence. The doorman at Clara's building was a former Royal Marine with an unflappable demeanor. Even he looked momentarily surprised when a haggarded, wild-eyed Nick Mercer appeared in the lobby, demanding to see his ex-wife. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer, but Mrs. Ashford is not accepting visitors," the doorman said, his voice polite, but firm as a steel barrier. "You see me," Nick snarled, jabbing a finger at the elevator bank. "Call her. Tell her I'm here." Clara, watching from the security feed on her tablet, felt a tremor of the old fear. The cornered animal was always the most dangerous, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, steady calm. She had been preparing for this moment. She pressed the intercom. "It's all right, Thomas. Send him up." When the elevator doors opened directly into her private foyer, Nick stormed out. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes burned with a desperate, hateful fire. He stopped short in the entrance to her living room, taking in the scene. Clara was not cowering. She was standing by the large window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, a porcelain teacup held delicately in her hand. She looked serene, untouchable, as if she were observing a mildly interesting weather pattern. Not the architect of her own ruin. "You," he breathed, the word a ragged exhalation of disbelief and fury. "This was you. All of it." Clara took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea before placing the cup on its saucer. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Nicholas." Her voice was light, airy, a stark contrast to his raw-edged rasp. "Don't play dumb with me," he roared, taking a step forward. "Maury, Jang, Vidian, the board. You poisoned them all against me." "Poison?" She tilted her head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "I would never use such a crude instrument. Poison is messy. It leaves a trail." She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw the steel beneath the silk. "I simply provided them with the truth. A truth you were kind enough to broadcast to the entire world. They made their own decisions based on that." He stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he thought he knew. The quiet, pliable wife he had molded and controlled was gone. In her place was this stranger, this queen in her castle, wielding a power he couldn't comprehend. "You destroyed me," he whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a pathetic, pleading tone. "Why, Clara?" "After everything, I gave you everything." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "You gave me nothing, Nick. You took my ideas, my insights, my youth, my name. You tried to take my worth. You stood on that stage and called me a liability after I spent 10 years being your single greatest asset. You didn't just divorce me, you tried to annihilate me. You thought you could define my value to the world. You were wrong." He flinched as if struck. It was a joke, a line for the speech. "It was the purest truth you've ever told." She countered, her voice dropping, losing its airy quality and taking on the hard edge of tempered steel. "Because to you, that's all I ever was, a number on a balance sheet. And when you thought my value had depreciated, you tried to write me off. It was a simple business decision, wasn't it?" She began to walk slowly toward him, her presence suddenly immense, Dominant. Well, I've made a simple business decision of my own. I've decided that your brand of business, the kind built on theft and disrespect, is a poor investment. And it seems the rest of the market now agrees. He was backing away from her now, retreating toward the elevator, a profound souled terror in his eyes. This was the ultimate power reversal. In their marriage, he had been the force of nature, and she the one who weathered the storm. Now she was the storm. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Is it money?" "I can get you money." Clara stopped, a look of genuine pity on her face. It was the same pity he had seen on the faces in the crowd at the gala. And seeing it directed at him from her was the final devastating blow. "You still don't understand," she said softly. "You think this is about money. You think this is about revenge." She shook her head. "This is about restoration. I am restoring my name. I am restoring the credit for my own work. And I'm restoring a certain balance to the world you inhabit. You built your empire on a lie, Nick. I'm just the one who finally sent the invoice." She turned her back on him, then a gesture of complete and final dismissal, and walked back to the window, picking up her teacup. It was a signal that the audience was over. Nick stood there for a long moment, a ghost in the foyer of a life that was no longer his. He had come here for a fight, for a release, for some way to reclaim his power. Instead, he'd been handed his own reflection, and it was ugly and small. He had been beaten, not by force, but by a quiet, unassailable truth. He had been erased, not by magic, but by the simple, devastating consequences of his own actions. He stumbled back into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, encasing him in his own reflection in the polished steel. He looked pathetic. He looked like a liability. In the cutthroat ecosystem of New York finance and real estate, a power vacuum is filled with the speed of a flash flood. The fall of Nick Mercer was not just a story. It was an opportunity. But the narrative that solidified in the weeks following his spectacular implosion was not what anyone expected. The initial whispers were of a hostile, unseen corporate raider. But as the dust settled, a new, more fascinating legend began to take shape. It was a story told in hushed tones in exclusive clubs, on private jets, and over 1,000 lunches. It was the story of Clara Ashford. No one had any concrete proof. There were no emails, no recorded calls, no paper trail linking her to the downfall of her ex-husband. There was only the undeniable sequence of events. The public humiliation followed by the silent, surgical, and total collapse of his empire. The business world, which Nick had believed was his exclusive domain, began to see the truth. They looked back at Mercer Development's history, at the uncanny timing of its best deals, at the sophisticated design aesthetic that had suddenly appeared, and they began to connect the dots. They remembered the quiet, elegant woman at Nick's side and saw her not as an accessory, but as the hidden architect. Tishima, in a rare interview with a respected Japanese financial journal, was asked about his decision to pull out of the Hudson Yards deal. He simply said, "We only partner with those who understand that a legacy is built on honor, not just on steel. We have recently entered into a new advisory relationship with a visionary who shares our values. Her name is Ashford." That single quote was a thunderclap. It announced Clara's arrival on the world stage, not as a socialite or an ex-wife, but as a formidable power in her own right. The Knight Andale Fund, her once secret venture capital firm, was suddenly the most talked about fund in the tech world. Startups clamored for her attention, not just for her money, but for her strategic guidance. The story of how she had backed Vidian, the green concrete company, became a case study in prescient values-driven investment. Clara didn't give interviews. She didn't issue press releases. She didn't need to. Her power was amplified by her silence. While Nick had built his brand on noise and self-promotion, Clara built hers on results and mystique. She was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand, and in a world of loud, egotistical men that made her the most intriguing and respected player in the game. Nick, meanwhile, had vanished. The comprehensive NDA he had been forced to sign had effectively muzzled him. His severance package, while substantial to an ordinary person, was a pittance in their world, and it was quickly being eaten away by legal fees and the cost of maintaining a lifestyle he could no longer afford. He sold his penthouse, his cars, his art. He was a pariah. Former friends and colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. The invitations stopped coming. He was a non-person erased from the world he had fought so brutally to conquer. His reputation was not just damaged. It was inverted. He was no longer the bold visionary. He was a cautionary tale, a symbol of arrogance and hubris. The story of his public humiliation of Clara was now retold with a new ironic twist. He hadn't been punching down. He had been picking a fight with a giant he was too blind to see. Clara's reputation, in contrast, was solidified. She was seen not as vengeful, but as just. She hadn't initiated the conflict. She had finished it decisively and with breathtaking efficiency. She had absorbed a public attack on her honor and responded not with emotion, but with a display of strategic brilliance that left the entire business world in awe. She had proven that true power wasn't about shouting from a stage. It was about owning the stage, the lighting, the theater, and the bank that financed it all. She had become a new kind of legend, one built not on a name she had taken, but on the one she had reclaimed. The city was hers. Clara stood on the terrace of her penthouse, looking out at the skyline. It was the same view Nick had coveted from his office, but she saw it differently. He had seen a collection of trophies, a scoreboard of his dominance. She saw a living system, a complex network of foundations, connections, and possibilities. She saw a canvas. Her life was quiet, but it was profoundly full. Her days were no longer structured around Nick's needs, but around her own purpose. She spent her mornings managing the Ashford family office and the Knight Andale Fund, her mind sharp and engaged, weaving together deals that were not just profitable, but meaningful. She was investing in sustainable energy, ethical technology, and female-led startups, building a new legacy brick by brick. Her afternoons were often spent in her studio, the scent of oil paint and turpentine replacing the memory of stale champagne. The canvases were larger now, the colors bolder. The chaos and turbulence of her earlier work had given way to a sense of structure and immense dynamic energy. She was not just painting abstracts. She was designing worlds. She felt no guilt for what she had done to Nick. Guilt was a useless emotion. She had acted not out of malice, but out of necessity. It was a matter of survival, of correcting a fundamental imbalance. She had not destroyed a man. She had dismantled a lie. The moral complexity of her actions was not lost on her. She had wielded immense power, a power that could corrupt as easily as it could create. But she was determined to wield it differently. Her father had taught her that power was a responsibility. Nick had treated it as a weapon. She would treat it as a tool to build, to protect, to empower others who, like her, had been underestimated and undervalued. Adrienne Blackwell joined her on the terrace, handing her a tablet. "The final papers on the Hudson Yards acquisition are ready for your signature," he said, a quiet smile on his face. After the collapse of Nick's financing, the half-started project had been put up for sale at a fire sale price. A consortium of investors led by a silent, anonymous principal had purchased it. That principal was Clara. "The new architectural plans have been approved by the city board," Adrienne continued. "The Ashford Tower is officially a go." She looked at the renderings on the tablet. It was a stunning, innovative design. A tower that seemed to breathe, covered in green spaces and powered entirely by its own sustainable systems. It was based on a series of sketches she had made years ago. Sketches Nick had once laughed at, calling them a child's fantasy. Now her fantasy would be the new glittering centerpiece of the Manhattan skyline. A testament not to ego, but to vision. She thought of Nick, a man so diminished he was barely a rumor. She had not erased him from the world, but she had erased him from her world. He was a ghost of a past she no longer inhabited. His public humiliation of her had been his final fatal act of self-sabotage. He had meant to define her as a liability, but instead he had liberated her, forcing her to reclaim the power she had kept hidden for a decade. He had handed her the sword, and she had used it to carve out a new destiny. She signed the document on the tablet with a simple fluid stroke of the stylus. Clara Ashford, her name, her tower, her city. She was not a liability or an asset. She was the architect, and she was just getting started. What Nick Mercer did was unforgivable. But Clara's response was legendary. She didn't just get even. She redefined the entire game. Her story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful, and that true strength isn't about public dominance, but about unshakable integrity. It shows that when you try to bury someone's worth, you might just be planting the seeds of their rise. If you were inspired by Clara's incredible story of justice and empowerment, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate redemption. What did you think of Clara's strategy? Let us know in the comments below.